Hey, this is Joe from the Recording Revolution. It's easy to get stuck in a rut when it comes to mixing. Today, I'm going to share with you 2 ways to add 2 new faders to your mix to kind of blow up your old paradigm of mixing and come at the mix from a completely different approach. If you've never tried these before, it really does kind of get the creative juices flowing because you're thinking about your mix in a completely different way, but you don't have to abandon your current mixing process. It's just a thing you can add to it that makes it a lot more interesting. Before we dive in, if you want to take the stuff we're going to talk about in this video and practice it yourself, but maybe you don't have any new tracks to mix, I have a couple of free mixing courses that you can have for free. Just go to recordingrevolution.com/MT for Mix Together. This is a series of, I think it's 3 seasons of a YouTube series where I mixed a song over the course of several videos, and you can have the tracks and mix along with me, and it's all 100% free. Just go to recordingrevolution.com/MT to get in on the fun. Just so we're all on the same page, what's a bus? A bus is just a spare fader that you can use, and you can route audio through it. So I could take my drums and send all of them to a drum bus. That's typically how I use them. However, there's lots of other ways you can use buses, and we're going to talk about 2 different ways to add 2 different buses to your mix to shake things up. So the first one is what I'm calling the drums and bass versus everything else mix. Here's how this works. Set up your mix like you normally would, but create 2 new buses, one called drums and bass and one called everything else. And I want you to route your drums and bass. Either what I would do is I route my drums bus and my bass bus to the drums and bass bus. A mouthful. You can maybe call it D&B if that's easier. And then route everything else in your session through the everything else bus. Now, that's simple enough. Here's what that looks like inside of Studio One. So I've got a drum bus and a bass bus. And I'm going to take these and I'm going to say add bus for selected channels. And we're going to call this our D&B. That's fine. D&B. And then I'm going to take all my other buses. So each of these is kind of a bus/folder type deal. I'm going to take all of these that are currently routed to the main output, and that's going to include all of these effects buses and everything over here that's going to the main output. And instead of going to the main out, I'm going to create a bus for those. So we're going to add a bus for selected channels, and we'll call that one everything else. So this is everything else in the mix. So I would put these right here next to one another. And I'd probably, just to make them stand out, make them a really bright red color, because these are kind of like my 2 mix buses. Okay, so what's the point? Well, the idea here is to create 2 different mixes. First, actually you can do either one first. I would start with drums and bass, and the idea is to get a wonderful sounding drum and bass mix. Fun fact, if the drums and bass are killer, everything else doesn't matter too much. I mean, it matters, but I've had mixes where the drums and bass feel so good that even left alone, it feels good. And then if we add in things like the rest of the tracks, it only makes it better. But if you can, the drums and bass, while they're challenging to mix, for sure, they do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the overall sound of the mix. Now, this only applies, of course, to songs with drums and bass in them. If you're doing like a bluegrass thing, this approach might not work well for you, but the next one will. We'll get to that in just a moment. So I do my drums and bass mix first, meaning I turn the other fader down or mute it, and I just sit here and live in drums and bass world for as long as it takes. Maybe it's an hour of me just doing drums, 2 hours, doesn't matter. Get a great sounding drum and bass mix that I'm really excited about. Then we just forget about it. We bring the fader down and we turn it off, make it go away, okay? Then we do the process again with our everything else mix. And the idea here is we're taking our guitars and our keyboards and our vocals, everything that's not drums or bass, and we're making a mix of it. So we're mixing it as if we didn't have drums and bass, almost as if this was like an alternate version that we're going to release, B-side on the record. That's we fired the drummer and the bass player, we're just doing a song without them. But the idea here is you can create a mix that sounds really good and really full and really amazing without the drums and bass. Then when you add them back in, it's like this magical like goosebumps moment where, holy crap, I'd forgotten that drums and bass existed. This song is so much better with them. So this approach solves a couple of problems. First, if you mix a song with big heavy drums and bass and a bunch of other stuff, it can be hard to hear the other stuff clearly while drums and bass are going nuts. So you end up, what happens to me is I'll forget about a track, or I'll overlook an entire section of guitars that I just can't really hear over the drums and bass, and either I forget about them altogether or they end up not being at the right place in the mix. What this allows me to do, if I mute drums and bass for an hour or so, I can now just focus on my guitars, keyboards, vocals, and I can hear them a lot better than I could with drums and bass blasting away. So this allows me to really put things in their place, you know how guitars tend to compete with one another, and vocals are the same way. It allows me to get things sounding nice and wide and beautiful and dynamic and all the things that we want. And if I can get it to sound really nice and full without being muddy, then when I bring those drums and bass back in, it is just a beautiful thing. So my goal when I do this is to have my everything else mix sound incredible and then bring drums and bass back in. Now the only thing I have to do is, if it's a little muddy with the full mix versus the drums and bass, I can just take a little bit of low end out of this entire mix, and kind of with two faders, I've got one with drums and bass, one for everything else, I can do maybe a little bit of a high pass filter on this one, or a low cut that matches the low end so that this one's not stomping on this one. But that takes just a couple of seconds to do, and you end up with this beautiful mix where all the details have been placed in the right place, and then you can just massage the faders to the right balance to get an incredible sounding mix. Now this second approach I learned from a live sound engineer years ago. I'd never thought about it, and he talks about doing it in the live environment, but I tried it in the studio and it was really fun, and I was able to get a really killer mix quickly doing this. So this is what I'm calling the low and high bus mix. So instead of, here we've got the drums and bass and everything else, right? Instead of that, we make one for all the lows and one for all the highs. And the idea here is we take things like everything that has low bass to it. So that's going to be just a handful of things. That's going to be things like, I'd probably throw kick. I would probably throw my toms in there because I just like them to be beefy. Let's go with our tom bus. And then bass guitar. Those are the main things, right? Those are going to carry the low end in my mix. I'm going to route those to the low, okay? And then everything else is going to go to the high. So I could literally just select everything else. Actually, they're kind of all going there. So just assume they're going there now. Then I have two faders here, one for my low frequencies and one for all the high stuff. It's similar to the other approach, but it's different, right? With the drums in their own group, we're getting the cymbals, we're getting all the frequencies of the drum kit. With this, we have basically a single fader for our low end and then a fader for everything else. So what's the deal with this approach? It almost feels like a multi-band approach. We're sending things that have low frequencies to a bus and everybody else to a different bus. And it's a twist on the last approach, but it's different in that there's a lot less going to the low bus, meaning we can mute the low bus and then listen to everything else and decide, okay, is anybody contributing muddiness or low end that shouldn't be? And it's an easy way to find out. When I mute my low bus, if I'm hearing a lot of whoa, 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 whoa from an acoustic guitar, I now know to go fix that. It's really quick and easy because I can, with one click, mute all my low end stuff and still be able to hear the low end on everything else, right? So I can identify and find those culprits that are being mean and are taking up all my low frequency bandwidth, and I can take care of those. So guitars, pianos, even like percussion and vocals can have a lot of low end to them. You don't realize it's there. You just know that your mix doesn't have the low end that you want. With this approach, you can solo the low end to hear it, but more importantly, you can mute all the low end instruments and only hear what's happening with everything else. And you can easily spot the ones that are causing your low-end woes. This one's not as fun as the other one when you've got drums and bass on a mix and everything else on a mix, but this one is practical, especially if you tend to have muddy mixes and you're having a hard time finding the culprits. Typically in a standard rock mix, it's really just kick drum and bass that are attributing to the low end. Everybody else should not be down in that really deep low end. That's reserved seating, right? Everybody else can take the higher frequencies. Low mids get built up pretty quickly, and you can decide, okay, do I want the bass to have a lot of low mids or not? And then I can mute that out and hear how the low mids sound on everybody else. It's a really cool way of working, and you just have to add 2 more faders to make it happen. One of the best things about this approach is with just 2 faders, you can very quickly do what I would call a mix reset by bringing both of those faders down and then bringing them back up one at a time. And if you've got a control surface or if you just do it with the mouse, you can literally just kind of massage the levels between the 2 to find that happy medium. Sometimes the mix is almost there and you just need to do a quick reset. It's just 2 faders, Bring one back up, then bring the other. And then maybe do the opposite. Bring the other one up and then the first one. And you'll find a spot where everything just goes, it's almost like it clicks into place and it feels amazing. And you only have to move 2 faders to do it. To do that with another way of mixing, you have to move lots of different faders, which can introduce a lot more variables to mess things up, right? But with just 2 variables, drums and bass, everything else, or low end, mids and highs, or whatever, low end, high end, you can just bring them in and just kind of reset things over and over and over again until you find a spot that feels really good. All right, if you enjoyed this video and you want to practice this on some tracks of mine and a few other folks that have donated tracks to me, it's all free. Go to recordingrevolution.com/MT, which stands for Mix Together. You get the tracks in an email, and then you can access the videos over on YouTube to work through the mix with me. All right, thanks for watching. See ya.